Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of you are living, learning, and working from. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. My name's Benjamin Spivak, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science, Swinburne University of Technology. I'm leader of the Psychology and Legal Processes research stream here at the Centre. It's my pleasure today to be hosting you for the CFBS seminar series. The series invites leading researchers to present the findings from novel empirical research related to forensic psychology and psychiatry, behavioural science, law, criminology, and related disciplines. The seminar series is held monthly, and this is our last seminar of the year. We do, however, have a keynote seminar that will be held in person on November 17th at our Hawthorne campus. We are lucky enough to have Don Weatherburn, who will be presenting work on the decline in crime detailed in his book, The Vanishing Criminal. Professor Weatherburn's talk is free to attend, but you must register due to limited seating. So let me just post a link in the chat for registration, which you can see if you access your chat. There we are. Okay. We'll be continuing the seminar series next year and bringing you many new and exciting talks. We have a few already lined up. If you'd like to be made aware of future seminars, please send an email to the address on the slide here. I'm extremely excited to be able to introduce our speaker for today's seminar. Dr. Molly McCarthy is a lecturer in criminology at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. She's very accomplished with qualifications in psychology, public health, and criminology. Dr. McCarthy has previously worked on a range of interesting topics, including identifying factors associated with police use of force and exploring the intersection of policing and disadvantaged communities. Today, we are lucky enough to be one of the first audiences to hear about Dr. McCarthy's most recent project, which explores potential reasons for the declines in youth offending, which have been documented over the past 2 to 3 decades in a range of Western countries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McCarthy. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you for inviting me to share my research. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen now. Hopefully this will work. Oh, thanks. I'll just let that load. But yes, as Ben mentioned, this is very much preliminary research that I'm presenting today. Can everybody see that? Yep. Okay, good. So I've been conducting some research over the past couple of months, and in fact, even the past couple of weeks, I've been working on this data with some collaborators, looking to try and disentangle the youth crime decline in Australia, to try and get a better feel for why it's happening, who's been affected, and what type of offences has changed. So as I mentioned, it is very much preliminary findings today, and I'll be really interested to hear from others here who are seeing the findings like me for the first time, and to hear from you what you think might be happening as well in terms of the particular jurisdictions that we're looking at today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm standing today, the Boonwurrung people of the Southeast Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So what I'm going to do today is briefly touch on some of the key theories that have been proposed for the youth crime decline internationally, and provide a brief overview of those theories and some emerging research in that space. I'll then provide some new trends analysis, looking at youth offending across 3 of the major states in Australia, so Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. I'll talk a little bit about what types of young people appear to be disengaging from crime, and which young people remain entrenched in the criminal justice system. And then lastly, reflect on how these emerging trends might reflect on some of the theories around the youth crime decline. So as many of you will be aware, there has been a decline in the number of young people engaged in offending behaviour for about the last 20 to 30 years, internationally, in the US, in the UK, also in Europe. It's been found in a number of, particularly Northern European countries. And also in Australia, we've had documented declines in youth offending since about the early 2000s. Initially, this decline was primarily a property decline, but more recently, or later on, it kind of expanded to encompass violent offending as well. And I say that with some hesitation because some of the trends that I'm showing today show a bit of shift in the trends, particularly around violent offending. And in this space, there has been a lot of hypothesis making, but not a lot of hypothesis testing. So partly that may be a function of constraints around data availability. So in order to look at what might be driving changes long term for young people, particularly over a 20-year period, we really need multi-year, multi-cohort data sets that can tell us firstly about changes in exposure to different types of risk factors, and also about young people's engagement in offending or delinquent behaviour. And we have very few of those data sets, not only internationally, but certainly we have very few in Australia. And so much of the research in this space to date has really relied on administrative data to get a handle on what might be happening and what might be driving youth offending trends. That's changing a little bit, and I'll talk about some of the emerging research that's been published in the last couple of years. And then there's, in terms of the theorising this space, that's kind of moved on as well. So there was two key theories that were really proposed early on that could explain the youth crime decline. One was the securitisation hypothesis, which proposed that it was the increased securitisation of property that was really changing the nature of the structural opportunities that were available for property crime. Things such as engine immobilisation technology in cars, which was made mandatory in Australia from about 2001 for any new car. Other forms of property securitisation as well have been enhanced over the years, which have in general made property crime a much more difficult crime to conduct, and in some cases less rewarding when that property can't be easily unlocked and unsold. So the argument is that property crime became too difficult for young people to do, and that was part of why they began to disengage or to reduce offending behaviour. Another key theory that was proposed early on was around notable changes in the routine activities or the daily activities of young people due to widespread internet access and the proliferation of smartphone technology and engagement in social media applications. It was argued that this was really changing the way in which young people spent their time and the settings in which they spent time. So they're more likely to be spending time at home, in kind of digitized contact with peers, so using social media or other apps to be in contact with peers, rather than spending time in person with peers, in parks, in shopping malls, in the streets, in those kind of settings where youth offending becomes much more likely or a higher risk. So in general, that young people were seen to be spending more time in lower risk environments, primarily in the home as a result of this expansion of internet access and smartphone technology. Oh, sorry, I'm relatively fresh to Teams, so bear with me as I work through this. So as I noted, there's been some an expanded kind of set of research has come through in more recent years, and I should say this research is still very tentative. There's a lot of so there's at least some contradictions across some of the findings in this research, and it's coming out of the US and some of the Nordic countries. But this research has found an association between changes in exposure to risks in family settings and in social and ecological settings for young people, and reductions in delinquencies in those countries. So in the kind of familial setting, what they've found is increased social bonds to parents has been associated with reduced delinquency amongst young people. And it's believed that those increased social bonds are related to increases in positive parenting practices. So we've had a kind of change in parenting practices. We tend to call it helicopter parenting, but in general, we've had a move away from corporal punishment, and a much the trends for parenting now are much more around building close social relationships with children. As part of that, there's also been increased time spent under parental supervision for young people in more recent cohorts. So again, young people are being subject to more guardianship in the home. In terms of social and ecological risks, they've found decreases in unstructured, unsupervised time spent with peers, decreased exposure to delinquent peers, decreased preferences for risky behaviour amongst young people, decreased alcohol consumption, and increased social bonds and attachment to school. So collectively, these things mean that young people are spending less time in risky contexts where offending behaviour and in fact victimisation can be more likely, and spending more time in the home in digitised contact with peers, and more attached to school, more time spent at school and engaged positively with school. Relatedly, there was a study by Twenge and Parks in 2019 in the US that found that in general, young people in the US are delaying risk-taking behaviours in their adolescent years. So they refer to these risk-taking behaviours as being the transition point to adulthood, or marking a transition to adulthood. So things such as learning to drive, drinking alcohol, having sex. In general, what this study found was that there's been a slowed developmental path in terms of adolescent behaviours, and those risk-taking behaviours, young people are delaying those risk-taking behaviours to later, to when they move into their 20s, for example. And Twenge and Park argued that this could be part of a slow life strategy for young people, which is related to early life exposure to smaller family size, higher life expectancy, lower pathogen prevalence, and higher median household income. So there's an argument there that at least some young people are engaged in a slow life strategy where they, because of the exposure in early life to these factors, that they tend to delay risk-taking behaviour, that they tend to see themselves as having a long life expectancy. They expect to spend a lot of time engaged in education and to be delaying their reproductive years substantially. And that may be a factor in Australia as well. Certainly it may be a factor in higher socioeconomic communities. And there is some evidence in Australia of decreases in learning to drive for adolescent males, and reductions in binge drinking by adolescents in recent years, which kind of might provide some support for the idea that there is a bit of a slow life strategy happening for some young people in Australia. Also, recent research tells us that these declines in youth offending are not uniform. So they appear to be comprised predominantly of by adolescent limited offenders rather than more chronic or persistent youth offenders. So many of you will be familiar with the age crime curve, and part of the age crime curve is a very notable peak in offending in late adolescent years. And what appears to be happening is that we're just having fewer young people engaging in that kind of offending behaviour as a normative part of late adolescence. So as part of that risk-taking, boundary testing kind of behaviour that young people do in late adolescence, which sometimes moves into offending behaviour, but usually for a time-limited period, there are less young people. It's becoming less normative to engage in offending behaviour in that late adolescent period. And in fact, there have been, in terms of chronic youth offenders, we haven't found any real reductions in terms of the number or volume of chronic youth offending, and in fact in Queensland, in the study I conducted in Queensland, I found growth in chronic youth offending at the same time as there'd been a decline overall in low to moderate offending. Also, research has found that youth offending declines have been much more notable for young people from more socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds. And in fact, a study by Nilsson and colleagues in Sweden found that they had growth in offending amongst young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds at the same time as they had this decline in offending amongst young people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And they proposed a number of theories for why there might be these divergent trends. One of their hypotheses was that there might have been increased economic inequality, or there has been increased economic inequality, but this might be leading to greater polarisation of life opportunities for young people, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, which might increase motivation for offending amongst those young people. They also suggested as a further hypothesis that, in fact, we haven't, in many jurisdictions, while we've had a reduction overall in offending, we actually haven't had a reduction in the number of police, the size of our police forces. So the other proposed hypothesis they had is that we have the same number of police, but concentrated into a smaller number of areas that have that continue to have high crime, and that might be leading to increased surveillance and charging and processing of the antisocial behaviour of young people in those communities. So overall, given the timing and persistence of the youth offending declines, there are likely to be multiple drivers of this decline in Australia and elsewhere. And a number of studies have attempted to identify period and cohort effects within the decline. So period effects refer to effects that are felt particularly in given certain years, and they tend to affect everyone the same way, ostensibly, all age groups in the same way. So, for example, a change in a policing approach, a change in some kind of criminal justice legislation might be expected to affect all people in that jurisdiction in a similar way in a given period. COVID-19 would be something that had a major period effect in terms of shifting the behaviours of individuals of all age groups in society in a given period. Cohort effects, on the other hand, are changes that occur that affect younger groups in particular, and therefore change the kind of behaviour of young people in subsequent cohorts. So, for example, when lead was banned from car exhausts, it was assumed that that should change the aggressive behaviour of young people in subsequent generations, because the developing brain would be responding to lead in a different way than, or it would have a much more formative effect on a developing brain than on adults. Likewise, COVID-19 might also have cohort effects as well as having period effects. So it might affect young people who are at particularly sensitive points in their development. It might affect their behaviour long term and subsequent cohorts, but that is something that remains to be seen over the longer term. So identifying period and cohort effects can be useful because it can help in disentangling what types of changes might be influencing youth offending behaviour, and identifying what key causal factors might be. So period effects tend to be things such as policing changes, legislation changes, policy changes that we see as a real sharp movement in a given year, whereas cohort effects tend to come through in terms of slower, longer term shifts in behaviour. So they tend to come through as more slowly shifting trend lines. So that can help us to understand what some of the drivers of the changes in youth offending might be. And for studies that have looked at period and cohort effects amongst young people, they have found that predominantly these are cohort effects, that there are the behaviour of young people coming through in recent generations has changed. But there is likely to be some interaction with period effects at the local level, so that trends within jurisdictions might look quite different because of the particular period effects that might be at play in those jurisdictions. So the data that I'm presenting to you today that is very, very fresh, and that I'll be interested to get your thoughts on. This is from a study that I'm leading called Disentangling Youth Offending Trends, Identifying Period and Cohort Effects. This study is funded by University of Melbourne Early Career Researcher Grant, and I have a number of collaborators on this study, including Dr. Ben Matthews from Stirling University in the UK, Dr. Troy Allard and Associate Professor Daniel Reynold from Griffith University, and my research assistant on this project is Mr. Sean McLaws. And in this project, we're drawing on administrative police data for children and adolescents aged 10 to 17 years, proceeded against by police from the earliest year available through to the most recent complete year, which is 2021. In some ways, it's unfortunate that that is the most recent year, because that is still a year in which the COVID lockdowns are likely to have been having an effect on youth offending behaviour. So the data I'm presenting today doesn't give clear insight into what has been the aftermath of those lockdowns in terms of youth offending behaviour, but it is the most complete year, the most recent complete year available. I'm drawing on a number of data sources for this project from New South Wales. I'm drawing on Boxer criminal incident data, For Queensland, this is QPrime data from the Griffith University Social Analytics Laboratory. And for Victoria, this is Victoria Police law enforcement data. And just to note that the data I'm presenting really represents alleged offenders. I'll be referring to youth offenders and offending by young people, but really these are alleged offences. In many cases, the court outcomes are not known. And so I'm going to be presenting some of the differences in trends across the states. And I think this is really interesting because they can tell us a little bit about the influence of criminal justice system policies or legislation, but also some of the differences in the socio-demographics of populations across Australia. And our populations are quite different, certainly across these 3 states, but in general, the context in different states for young people can be dramatically different. And some of the analysis I'm going to present, a lot of the analysis I'm presenting today will be descriptive overviews of trends, but some of the analysis I'm going to present is results from age period and cohort modelling, which uses an intrinsic estimator to kind of decompose age, period and cohort effects from long-term trends. So this type of analysis tries to pull out what is an effect of age, what is an effect of a cohort, a birth cohort, and what could be an effect of that particular period. So before I get into the age period cohort modelling, I just wanted to provide a broad overview of the nature of youth offending trends across the 3 states, and also just to note that there are obviously differences in time periods here. So in blue, we have the New South Wales trend, which represents the longest time series trend in this data set, running from 2001 to 2021. Victoria, we've got data from 2005 to 2021, and for Queensland, it starts in 2008 through to 2021. So you can see that Queensland is the green line, New South Wales is the blue line, and Victoria is the orange line. And this first graph is just showing overall offending prevalence, so the number of young people in each year who are charged with any offence in a given year. And I should say a lot of the data I'm presenting today is adjusted to the population of young people in that year, in that jurisdiction, just to account for any major movements in population over these periods. So you can see here in terms of the number of young people who have contact with the criminal justice system, the trends for that show a clear linear decline for all of the states. We do have a fewer number of young people having contact with the criminal justice system in each year, and that's been fairly consistent over the past 15 to 20 years, depending on the state. The second graph shows youth offending frequency, so the number of charges against young people in each jurisdiction in each year. And these lines are much flatter. So there are some declines that are associated, obviously, with the COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020 and 2021 in Victoria and New South Wales. But in general, these are flatter trend lines. And so there hasn't been as much clear decline in the frequency of youth offending. So that suggests that we have fewer young people having contact with the criminal justice system. But for those who do have contact with the criminal justice system, it's happening on a more frequent basis. So turning now to some of the results of the age period and cohort models. And for this analysis, I'm really just going to focus in on the cohort effects because I think the period effects are quite complicated to kind of work through in each state, and the age effects generally just reflect the age crime curve where you see an increase in offending by age. But so my focus on this will be in the central panel, the cohort effects. And you can see along the bottom here, this model estimates the year of birth for young people and then estimates an effect for each birth cohort. And where they pass this middle line, that's kind of the mean for the overall for the cohorts. When they move above this line, that means that these cohorts are above the mean for the overall group of cohorts or below the mean. So this is just starting with the total prevalence rates of offending for in New South Wales. And you can see here there was a shift, there were higher rates of offending prevalence for young people born in kind of 1984, 1985, so turning 10 in about 1994, 95, which then declined for young people born in about 91, 92. That's when we saw a bit of a shift. So young people turning 10 in about 2001, 2002. There was a reduction in offending prevalence or the likelihood of contact with the criminal justice system for an offence, and that stayed pretty flat and has continued to decline in more recent years. The other thing to note about this analysis is that the confidence intervals are wider as we get towards the end of the cohorts, because for 2010 and 2011, we only have 1 or 2 age points at which to try and estimate a cohort effect. So there's more uncertainty about those effects. The wider confidence intervals can also affect just more variability within a cohort, and I think we'll see some of that as well as we move through these charts. Moving now to Victoria, so a similar kind of decline in Victoria, but it occurred at a later stage. So offending prevalence was a bit higher to start with for young people born in 88 and 89, so turning 10 in about 98, 99. And then it started to decline for young people born in about 2004, 2005. So turning 10 in about 2014, 2015, there is then a pretty consistent decline in offending prevalence for the subsequent cohorts. And then looking at Queensland, there's a similar kind of effect here. Higher levels of offending prevalence for young people in the early cohorts, and then that changes when young people are born in about 2004, 2005, so turning 10 in about 2014, 2015, there is then a decline, but a very uncertain decline. So this suggests these the wide confidence intervals here suggest a lot of variability in these recent trends in Queensland, but overall a mean decline. Turning now to total property offence frequency rates, so the frequency with which young people were charged with property offences. And you can see for New South Wales, this is New South Wales trend, a kind of curvilinear trend occurring in New South Wales, where property offending frequency started out relatively low, and that was for young people born in 84, 85, so turning 10 in about 94, 95. And then it started to increase for young people born in about 91, 92, so turning 10 in about 2001, 2002, and stayed high for a consistent period before it started to decline again for young people born in about 2005, 2006, so turning 10 in about 2015 and 16. But again, a very uncertain trend for property offending in amongst more recent cohorts in New South Wales. Now turning to Victoria for property offending, there were some initial declines for young people born in about 91, 91, and then they lifted up again for subsequent cohorts, and then started to decline for young people born in about 2005, 2006, so turning 10 in about 2015, 2016. And Queensland shows a somewhat similar trend, so initially higher rates of property offending, which then reduced for people born in about 97, 98, so turning 10 in about 2007, 2008, and they stayed fairly low or relatively low compared to the earlier cohorts. But there's a lot of uncertainty about around property offending in recent cohorts in Queensland. Now looking finally at violent offending across the states. So for New South Wales, we have another curvilinear shape, but this time in a different direction. So violent offending frequency amongst the cohorts started relatively higher for young people born in 84, 85, so turning 10 in about 1994, 95. And then it declined for young people who were born in 1990, 91. Violent offending frequency started to decline. And then it started to pick up again for young people born in about 2005, 2006, so turning 10 in about 2015, 2016. There is a somewhat similar frequency or a curvilinear shape for violent offending in Victoria, and you can see here that it was relatively high to start with for cohorts born in 1988 and 89, so turning 10 in about 98, 99, and it started to decline for young people born in about 92, 93. And then stayed low for subsequent cohorts and started to pick up again for young people born in about 2002, 2003, so turning 10 in about 2012, 2013. And then we've got a very uncertain kind of trend in terms of violent offending in Victoria, with a lot of movement upwards and downwards and a widening confidence interval. And then for Queensland, we have a similar kind of curvilinear shape Violent offending started a bit higher. So for young people born in 91, 92, so turning 10 and about 2001, 2002, violent offending was higher. It started to decrease for young people born in about 98, 97, so turning 10 in about 2008, 2007. Flip those years around, and it stayed low for a few years, but then started to come up again for young people born in about 2002, 2013, 2003, so turning 10 in about 2012, 2013, and it has stayed relatively high, and then dropped during COVID, but again, a lot of uncertainty around that. So some of that uncertainty I'll come back to later, because it may reflect more divergence in trends within both cohorts around youth offending. We may be starting to see greater divergence in youth offending trends. So what I wanted to do was also to provide a broad overview of trends around property offending and violent offending by young people across the states. And the trends look quite different across the states. There are some commonalities, but there are a lot of differences as well. So this is the trends for New South Wales, and I've separated them out into boys and girls. And you can see here for boys, there has been an increasing property offending rate over time that did come down in during the lockdown years for COVID in 2020 and 2021. And likewise, we have a similar shape for girls, that it was going up and it came down in those years. But what is interesting about this is I had a look at these two kind of this growth, this peak that was occurring in 2015, 2017, and a lot of that was due to an increase in fair evasion offences. So we don't tend to think of fair evasion as a property offence, but it is classified as theft in the Australian New Zealand Standard Offence Classification Scheme. But it is a more detected offence rather than a reported offence. And this growth in the charging of fair evasion offences for young people seems to line up with the introduction of Transport Police in New South Wales in 2014. So that at least some of that growth appears to be related to concentrated policing of young people on public transport in particular. So I wanted to share that because I think that's not what we normally expect when we see growth in property crime, that it would be at least quite a substantial proportion related to fair evasion offences. Turning now to Queensland, a much more mixed trend for property offending amongst boys. It was declining between 2012 and 2015, but has since started to move upwards again, and certainly there was an increase during the COVID-19 years. And Queensland obviously had far fewer lockdowns than Victoria and New South Wales in those years. Girls are showing a similar kind of a trend with, again, an uplift during 2020 and 2021. In Victoria, we're seeing quite a different picture. So we're seeing quite a clear linear decline in property offending prevalence, property offending rates, I should say, amongst boys, and a somewhat kind of similar decline amongst girls, though much less notable decline amongst girls. Turning now to violent offending amongst young people. So this is just the rate of violent offences for young people in each year, and again separated by girls and boys. And you can see that in New South Wales there has been a declining trend for violent offending, and for girls much less so. In fact, it's a slow growing trend. So it's not overall a decline in that period for girls, it's actually a growth. So different trends going on there for boys and girls in New South Wales. In Queensland, we're seeing in recent years a slow uplift in the violent offending trends for boys and for girls after some initial declines between about 2012 and 2015. And in Victoria, a much more volatile trend for violent offending. So it's much more difficult to say what's happening in Victoria. Certainly there were declines during COVID-19 lockdown years, but other than that, it's not clear in what direction these trends are heading. And amongst girls, we're also seeing a slow linear uplift in the rate of violent offending. So partly the reason for some of this volatility might be, again, divergent trends that are occurring within recent cohorts of young people. So one of the things I wanted to explore in this data is differences across young people when they're classified into the kind of frequency of contact with the criminal justice system. So looking at, I've classified young people as one-off offenders if they've been charged with one offence in a year, low to moderate if they've been charged with between 1 to 5 offences in a year, and chronic if they've been charged with 6 or more offences in a year. And I should say that the definitions of chronic offending in the literature are very much arbitrary. They tend to rely on relative kind of comparisons about the volume of offending over a given time period. But 6 or more offences represented a relatively consistent structural break in the trends across each of the jurisdictions in terms of where offences were decreasing and where they were increasing. So it may be a meaningful group in that sense. And certainly it's a very conservative definition of chronic offending. Much of the definitions in the literature have a much lower threshold than this. So you can see here very different trends according to whether young people are classified as one-off, low to moderate or chronic in any one year. In New South Wales, you can see in the orange, the low to moderate offenders, in blue, the one-off offenders. Sorry, these are offences for young people classified in that into those categories. So this is offences for young people classified as low to moderate offenders in any year. The blue line is offences for young people classified as one-off, and the green line is offences for young people classified as chronic offenders. And you can see there are declines in offending for one-off and low to moderate offenders, but an increase in offending for young people classified into the chronic offending category in New South Wales, starting to with the offending rate starting to outstrip the offending rate for those other, or the volume of offences generated by those other groups. In Queensland, there's much more clearly a linear increase in the volume of offending by young people classified as chronic offenders. And at the same time, there's a slow decline in offending by young people classified as low to moderate and young people classified as one-off offenders. And in Victoria, we see this high levels of volatility amongst young people classified as chronic offenders, and that really is the volume of that offending is really outstripping offending done by young people classified as one-off and low to moderate, which is showing a very clear linear decline over that time period. So that does tend to suggest that there are increasingly polarized trends in terms of youth offending. And I wanted to also just look at the number of young people that are classified as into those categories in any one year. So what I presented before was the volume of offending. Now this is just the number of young people classified into those groups in each year. And you can see that chronic offenders constitute a very small group. They might be now generating the majority or the highest volume of offences, but they remain a very small group in number. But there hasn't been much shift in that group. In New South Wales, you can see a slight shift downwards during COVID-19, but not a clear linear decline in the number of young people classified as chronic, whereas you can see clearer linear declines for the number of young people classified as one-off and low to moderate. Likewise, in Queensland, you can see clearer linear declines for the number of young people classified as one-off and low to moderate, but a pretty flat line for the number of young people classified as chronic. And in Victoria, we've got really clear declines in the number of young people classified as one-off and low to moderate. I'm sure that kind of steep decline in Victoria for the number of young people classified as one-off must reflect some shift in legislation or policy because it's quite a sharp turn. But the number of young people classified as chronic has remained relatively stable, although it did decrease during those lockdown years, 2020 and 2021, as you might expect. So what this is telling us overall is that there might have been actually a notable increase in the number of young people classified as chronic. In Queensland, there is likely to have been a small increase, but in New South Wales and Victoria, there doesn't appear to have been an increase in the number of young people classified as chronic, but they are generating more offences. So there's been a shift in frequency amongst already high frequency offenders. So this is the trend appears to be that young people who might have previously been charged with 6 or 7 offences in a year are now being charged with 11 or 12 offences in a year. That's where the growth in the volume of offending is occurring. So as I mentioned, what we're seeing is that greater polarisation of youth offending behaviour. There's reductions in low and moderate offending and one-off offending, but increases in the frequency of offending for young people classified as chronic. So I think it's worth reflecting on who are these young people, because these are the young people that haven't really benefited from the youth crime decline. They remain engaged and entrenched in the criminal justice system. So what research tells us about the nature of these young people is they tend to come from backgrounds of disadvantage and poverty. They tend to be disengaged from school early. A disproportionate amount will have a diagnosed or undiagnosed cognitive disability or impairment or a learning disability. They often have experiences of poor parental attachment, abuse, neglect, or trauma. And in Queensland, previous research has found that we have a disproportionate concentration of those young people in regional and remote areas and among Indigenous young people. So I just wanted to spend a bit of time looking at the distribution of Indigenous young people across these groups, because I think this is a really important issue to attend to. So this is a very rough and ready analysis of the number of Indigenous young people or young people who have been recorded as being Indigenous in the offence records, how they are distributed across the categories of one-off, low to moderate and chronic, compared to young people who are classified as non-Indigenous. So what you can see here, if we just look at the proportion that end up in the chronic offending category across the states, for Indigenous young people who have contact with the criminal justice system, they're much more likely to end up in a chronic offending category compared to non-Indigenous young people. So in New South Wales and Victoria, approximately just under a third of Indigenous young people who have contact with the criminal justice system have it at the level of frequency that we would classify as being chronic. And in Queensland, that's up to 50%, whereas the much lower proportions of non-Indigenous young people who have contact with the criminal justice system end up engaged in a kind of chronic offending trajectory. And now just looking at the cohorts that we've classified as chronic in this study in each of the states and what the proportions are across Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And again, there's just a huge overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in those chronic offender groups. So 41% of chronic offenders in New South Wales are Indigenous, 14% in Victoria and 20% in Queensland. So much higher than we would expect if we were expecting an even distribution based on population distributions. So I think that's really important to bear in mind in terms of thinking about chronic offenders and how we respond to them. There is a notable overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in this group, and chronic offenders are the young people who are going to be spending more time in custodial settings, and they're also the young people who are more likely to go on to graduate into the adult criminal justice system, into adult custodial settings. So the way that we shape our responses to chronic youth offenders will, to some degree, reflect on the extent to which we can address the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in our custodial systems. So I think that needs to be front and centre when we think about how can we potentially reshape responses to chronic youth offenders, given that they are the young people who remain engaged in the system. So just reflecting now back on some of the potential causes that have been identified in the literature and how that kind of matches with what I've been showing you today, these kind of emerging trends in youth offending. In terms of the securitization hypothesis, I think there's no doubt that the higher securitization of property is placing downward pressure on opportunistic property crime. However, there has been evidence of adaptation by chronic youth offenders who now generate the majority of property crime. So in Queensland, we've had research that has documented that now theft of cars is often accompanied by a break and enter to steal car keys. So securitization doesn't necessarily solve the issue that we're having with chronic youth offenders, but it may explain why we've had the reduction in more adolescent limited or one-off youth offending. Changes in routine activities, reductions in unsupervised, unstructured time spent with peers. There is likely to be a high probability that this changed exposure to high-risk settings is having an influence on the rate of offending amongst young people. And certainly the timings of a reduction in offending prevalence happening around those when young people are turning 10 and about 2013, 14, 15, those are time periods in which smartphone technology really was taken up by younger age groups, and where there was a proliferation and embrace really of social media by young people. So that may be playing a role there. Maybe some displacement of that in-person peer contact with digitized social contact with peers, and that might be reducing exposure to risky settings for young people. In terms of the slow life strategy, slowed adolescent developmental pathway, that's possibly a factor, particularly in households with higher median incomes. And the timing of the declines in prevalence in New South Wales certainly suggests that that might be a contributor. And as I mentioned earlier, the declines in driving and binge drinking amongst adolescents provide further support for a general trend towards a delay in risk-taking behaviour amongst young people. And so that I guess then turns to the question of what might be causing the polarising of youth offending trends. So there's certainly the case that some young people may be living in contexts where spending more time at home is neither safe nor desirable, and they may not be experiencing increased social bonds with parents or greater supervision by guardians. So that might not be, therefore, creating this reduction in in-person contact for certain groups of young people with their peers. So young people from family backgrounds that are not necessarily safe, or where they're not necessarily close to parents, or where they might be living in out-of-home care settings, may be more inclined to be still spending time in in-person peer settings where they might be at higher risk of engaging in offending behaviour. In terms of the hypothesis around slower developmental paths, well, that's likely to be affecting young people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds more than it is from young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So we might have a bit of a two-speed effect happening in terms of our recent cohorts of young people. Some may be on a slower life strategy, and some may still be on a fast life strategy where they are engaging in higher risk behaviours at earlier time points. And then in terms of the hypotheses that Nielsen and colleagues suggested in terms of more concentrated policing of disadvantaged communities, or increased experiences of inequality or strain amongst cohorts of young people who feel locked out of social or economic opportunities, I think these remain plausible hypotheses. They're not easy to discern from the data I presented today. But certainly policing might be a factor when we're seeing this increased frequency of contact with the criminal justice system for the young people who remain engaged in offending behaviour. And I think there's certainly areas that it would be worthwhile looking at for future research. So to conclude, youth offending prevalence has declined across all of the states, New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, but the frequency of youth offending hasn't demonstrated as much of a decline. However, there were declines during COVID-19 for youth offending in Victoria and New South Wales. There has been a clear divergence and polarisation of youth offending trends, with declines predominantly comprised of one-off and low to moderate youth offending, and with some growth in the volume of offending by chronic youth offenders. Property crime is showing more obvious declines than violent crime, which remains quite volatile in some states, and boys are showing more declines in offending behaviour than girls. And there's likely mixed causes for the divergent youth offending trends, including securitisation of property, changes in routine activities, and slowed developmental paths. But it goes without saying that increases in protective factors and decreased risky activities may be distributed differentially across young people, and may be affecting young people more in, maybe benefiting young people more in more socially, economically advantaged areas, and in families with greater social and economic resources. And I think with the lack of decline in chronic youth offending, with the high overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in the chronic offender cohorts, and the high cost to the criminal justice system, and I've just cited there some work that I did with colleagues, Dr. Troy Allard and the late Professor Anna Stewart, where we found that chronic offenders generated the majority of costs to the criminal justice system, particularly for young people in the youth justice system. I think all of this creates a really strong case for thinking further about how we shape effective prevention, early intervention and assistance and rehabilitation responses to young people engaged in chronic offending trajectories, and think about more strengths-based, community-connected and community-led, culturally appropriate and positively incentivised responses to these young people. So thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Molly. I'm sure if we could hear everyone, there'd be a lot of applause right now. But unfortunately, the settings are that people can't. Yep, I'm seeing some.
Yeah,
Yep,
thanks.
fantastic. Good. All right. So previously, the way this worked is we had a Q&A kind of button, but I realized you can't use that through Teams if you're using a browser. So I've opened up chat for people. If you are struggling to find chat, you can see it there. And we'll monitor chat and ask questions that way. I had a question in the meantime.
Yeah.
I noticed there wasn't much around. I mean, was there much exploration of criminal justice policy in terms of the shifts in youth offending? So, for instance, the decision to informally caution or caution by police.
Well, that's part of the broader aims of this project, and I'm really only at the start of working through this data. So the period effects in those panels are intended to try and unpack some of what might be shifts in criminal justice system policy or legislation and how that might affect trends. And as part of that, we're going to actually interview people working in the criminal justice system who could give us some insights into what might be some of the major shifts that would be affecting youth offending behaviour. But undoubtedly, there is a role of those things, and the period effects are intended to help us kind of get to that, but just haven't got there yet.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more once you do start to unpack that part of your research. People access the meeting chat? Tested it earlier.
I can access the chat.
So can I. We tested it a moment ago.
No questions.
No questions. You've just done such a thorough job.
I just bulldozed over the whole presentation.
Here we go. Okay. From Michelle. Might be off topic, but what do you think of fare evasion being classified under property crime?
Oh, yeah, that's a big question. I mean, it's been defined technically as theft by the Australian New Zealand Standard Offence Classification Scheme, but it's not what I think when we think about property crime, we think about theft, we think about break and enter, maybe property damage. We think about offences that tend to be more reported than detected, and so it's useful to unpack, I think, the nature of offending underneath the kind of high level, classification of property, because there can be some of these unusual trends that you don't necessarily expect to see in property crime. So something that is such a detected offence, shifting the pattern of property trends in New South Wales quite dramatically. It's not something I was expecting to see. So I don't know whether I agree or not. I mean, technically, it probably does fit in terms of property crime, but it certainly does suggest that we need to look closely at the kind of offence categories that get subsumed into these higher level categories of, property and violent crime, that kind of thing.
Our next question comes from Amelia. Are there any thoughts about why there has been less reduction in chronic offending for females compared to males?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. In general, I think there's been less declines in offending overall amongst females than males, which is kind of intriguing given that if these theories hold, if these theories are correct about changes to high risk or high-risk settings, then they should be affecting behaviour for both young women and young men. So young boys and girls, I should say. I'm really not sure why girls are not, in fact, showing growth in offending in some cases, and certainly not as clear a decline in boys. But I think overall, you know, when people have talked about the youth crime decline being a property decline, I would also say the youth crime decline has really been a decline in offending behaviour by young boys. That is generally what has been found pretty consistently. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's intriguing. I'm wondering if social media plays a role in terms of provoking incidents of violence in some cases. That's something I'm certainly interested in, but I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't give a clear answer on that.
Our next question is from Nina. Super thought-provoking. Thanks, Molly. What are your thoughts on the different youth offending prevalence rates per 10,000 persons across the 3 states, particularly lower prevalence in Victoria relative to the other 2 states?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. I don't know. What I will say is that there is definitely an impact of the distribution of socioeconomic resources, I guess, across states. And so it's not surprising to me that Queensland is featuring high levels of offending by young people. It just has much larger areas of concentrated disadvantage than some of the other states. But why Victoria is lower, I don't know. And that's hopefully something we'll get to when we start looking at the period effects, whether there is some local effect, but it could be a population effect. It could be around legislation and policy. But yeah, I'm not, in terms of relative prevalence, there's also, obviously there's going to be differences in how each state defines legislation and their approaches to policing. So just in terms of you know, how many categories of offences there are, that will shift across the states. But yeah, I don't know. Perhaps the analysis of the period effects will give us more insight into that. But yeah, really good question.
Okay, we have 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. So our next question comes from Madison. Great presentation, Molly. With a higher prevalence of Indigenous youth classified as chronic offenders in Queensland compared to other states, is there research that suggests why this might be?
Yeah, is there research? I guess there's been a lot of research that has tried to untangle what are the drivers of the overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in the criminal justice system in general. And I guess there are some debates about how much it is just simply greater exposure to a greater magnitude of risk factors for offending and how much it might be differential responses to Indigenous young people. One thing that I'm particularly interested in, and I feel is likely to be a factor in Queensland in particular, is the level of formal surveillance that Indigenous young people are subject to, particularly in remote and regional areas, just by virtue of them being smaller geographically contained communities where there is a higher concentration of police. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's lots of police, but it doesn't take that many police to increase the concentration at a per capita level in those communities. And so the young people in those communities will be seeing police much more regularly, and police will be seeing them much more regularly than would happen, for example, for a normal a non-Indigenous young person in an urban setting. So I do wonder to what extent that exposure to high levels of formal surveillance by police in the early years may contribute. But in terms of responses, I think part of the issue for Indigenous young people is that if they get diversion early on, that high levels of frequency of recontact just means that they get locked out of some of those diversion opportunities pretty early on in their lives. And so they can be subject then to more, more punitive kind of criminal justice sanctions. In terms of culturally safe practices, I think that's a big area to explore in the youth justice system. I think we need to, given the overrepresentation of Indigenous young people, we need to be exploring that much more fully. Are we doing the ways that we're approaching supporting these young people towards assistance? Are they culturally safe? Do they work for these young people? And if not, should we be doing something a bit different?
Okay, thank you. Final question from Lauren, who's wondering whether there were any statistics on rates of youth sexual offending. I presume that means if you examined that as part of your kind of research.
Yeah, well, not separately. They're included in the rates of violent offending. From what I could see in the data, I think they have come down slightly after increases in, the previous 10 years or so, which I think were argued to be in part a reporting increase. From what I recall from the data, I think they have come down a little bit. Where we're seeing the growth in violent crime is in assaults or offences, acts intended to cause injury, and robbery in some states. In Victoria and in Queensland, there's been an increase in robbery recently. Those are the most notable in terms of volume of increase. That's where the most notable increases are in terms of violent crime. But yeah, I don't think there's been notable decreases either in sexual offending, but I don't think we've seen major increases in recent years.
Okay, wonderful. Well, look, that's all in terms of questions. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Molly. We'll have to have you back as you kind of continue this research and uncover more findings and explore some of these avenues. But it was a fantastic presentation. And
Thanks, Ben. Yeah,
look out for the.
back.
Sorry?
I'm happy to come back.
Oh, we'd love to have you back. And look out for the recording. We're just seeing if we can have permission to release it. And if we do have permission, it'll be on YouTube for your viewing pleasure. Okay.